Hello students, it's Professor Russo again, and we're wrapping up chapter 5 and eliciting a narrative from a child after the ground rules or the narrative practice. In other words, the kinds of questions, the approach that we should take when the child has opened the door to what may have happened to them, and we need to question the child about that event. And we need to do it in a forensically defensible way. We need to do it with minimal leading questions or suggestive questions. We need to provide a context and a foundation to allow the child to express themselves, to allow the child to provide a narrative. So we're going to look at some very common issues in almost every forensic interview and what best practice has taught us about approaching these issues. The first thing I'd like to discuss with you is the double check. Professor Poole talks about the double check in chapter 5. And what we mean by the double check is sometimes at the end of a thought or an idea, you want to refer back to the event itself and ask the child to go over not the whole narrative, not the entire discussion about the time in the shed or the time in the truck or the time in the master bedroom, but just to go back and clear up some issues that might have been confusing to the interviewer or might have been ambiguous. So by the double check, we mean something like this. You know, Daniela, thank you for telling me everything that happened when you were in the truck in back of the 7-Eleven. But I'm a little confused about what happened when you got into the back seat. And what you're doing here is you're cueing their memory, you're taking them back to the beginning of their narrative usually, and you're telling them that you don't understand and you want them to clarify or you want them to provide some more information. So you're setting the table for them to go through what happened with a little more detail. So you might say, when you got in the back seat, what was the first thing that happened? Tell me again about what happened after he said, be quiet, or after he put his hand on your mouth. What happened next? And you said when it was all over, he told you to clean up the seat. Tell me more about that. I'm confused. What did you do when you cleaned up the seat? Something like that. You're performing a double check. And what's happening here is you're having the child provide more detail. You're having the child go over the events and you're having them clear up some things that you might have found confusing or ambiguous. The purpose here is not to simply have them tell it again. That's not what we're doing here. We're not simply having them recount what they already said. The purpose here is to clear up things that it might have been confusing, clear up things that it might have been ambiguous, and in that process, you are taking the child back to the beginning of the narrative about this specific act or incident, and they will not only clear up what was confusing or ambiguous, they may in fact provide some more details and you might get more information, and that information may make their account more persuasive and more compelling. That's the double check. Something else that comes up in nearly every interview, and it's something that we have to be very careful with because we know that repeated questioning, asking the same question twice or more than twice, has the potential to distort children's memories and to produce unreliable information from children. Part of the reason is if a child answers our question and we ask it again, they may get the message that the first answer wasn't good enough, it wasn't correct, or the grown-up didn't like the first answer. So we want to avoid repeated questions, but there may be times where we have to ask the question again. Perhaps their answer was ambiguous, perhaps their answer was incomprehensible or hard to understand. So sometimes we need to repeat ourselves and repeat the questions. The key point to remember when repeating questions is you need to say a question a second time when there's a purpose or a reason, when you need clarification or you can't understand something, or the response is peculiar or unexpected based upon what you've already learned or based upon the factual scenario. So the key is if you're going to ask a question a second time or even a third time, you need to switch it up a little bit. Just change the question slightly. Very often it's because they don't understand the question, and they don't always tell you they don't understand. There may be something about the question that is hard for them to comprehend, or something about the question that's confusing. And despite the ground rules, they may not tell you that they're confused. So it's important to ask the question a different way if you're going to use repeated questions. Another common issue, and you may remember when we discussed children and language early in this course, Professor Walker advises us of some pitfalls of language. One area that's especially problematic, and interviewers, for some reason, love to preface questions as follows. Daniela, do you remember if Daddy took you in the shed? This do you remember stuff, or do you recall, or its cousin, if you will, do you know, as in, do you know if he used something? Do you know if he came in the bedroom? These phrases, do you remember, do you recall, do you know, are what's known as surplusage. I call it surplusage. It's extra stuff that you don't really need in the question, and it tends to be confusing. It may give the child who has a disincentive, in many cases, to not talk about the abuse and not inform on someone they know, love, or trust. It gives them an out. They could say, I don't remember, when they truly don't remember, or they could say, I don't remember because they don't want to talk about it. Or they can say, I don't remember, or I don't know, because they don't understand the question. It is perilous to use, do you remember, do you know, do you recall? It's not a good idea, and interviewers do that all the time. It takes a lot of practice to stop doing that. It takes a lot of practice to avoid using those preambles. Do you know, do you remember, do you recall? And any question that starts out that way, you can change it without affecting its meaning. And you can make it a better question and not even change it one iota by saying the actual question itself. For example, do you remember if he came in the room? Did he come in the room? Do you recall if he put anything in the closet? Did he put anything in the closet? Do you know if mommy was home? Was mommy home? You see, and those kinds of questions really call for a memory search. They can be misleading. There's a lot of linguistic reasons for not using those beyond the ones I just shared with you and beyond the other reasons that I expressed a moment ago. So if you're going to be an interviewer and you want to interview kids, it's a good idea to teach yourself how to avoid those kinds of DUR questions, we call that. It's really an advanced skill, but you can do it. If you do this long enough, it can be done. So that's something that you want to avoid, if possible, as much as you can, the DUR questions. Another issue that comes up a lot, and something that Professor Walker has reminded us about when we discussed language early in this course, are why questions. Why questions. And they can be problematic for two reasons. First of all, small children don't even really understand their motivations. They certainly are in no position to understand and appreciate the motives of others. So asking, why did Daddy go up in the bedroom before he came back down? Or why was Mommy not home that day? Or why did Mommy put the cake on the table? Would call for speculation. They have a hard time even understanding their own motives. Now, you could try those questions in that context, but sometimes you're going to get an I don't know, and sometimes you're going to get a peculiar response. It's going to call for speculation, especially when we're asking a child to speculate about the motives of a third party. They don't have enough life experience to really give us a good answer to a question that calls for speculation. They're too small, they're too young. The other reason why we don't like why questions is why questions tend to be accusatory. So a common one is, well, why didn't you tell somebody? If Mommy was in the other room, why didn't you call out to Mommy? Why didn't you scream? Why didn't you tell your dad? Why didn't you tell your priest? These why questions can come off as accusatory, and that's the last thing that we want to do to a child during a forensic interview. That doesn't mean that those kinds of questions are not important. Sometimes they are important. Sometimes people, sometimes supervisors, sometimes jurors might have that same question. Some of them are legitimate and some aren't. I'll give you an example of one that would pop first thing into a juror's mind if this case had gone to trial. There was a 9-year-old girl who was molested by her chess instructor after school. He would keep her after school, and the other students would leave, and he molested her a few times first semester. And when she gave a statement about what happened, she described what happened, and she talked about the first few times it happened. And she described it in a way that was very negative. She didn't like it. She was afraid of him. She didn't want to go back. But she finished out the semester. Now, when her mom asked her whether she wanted to take part 2 of the chess lessons in the second semester, she agreed to take the lessons. So that seems a bit peculiar. Here's a negative experience for a child. Here's something that was over. It required an affirmative act by the child to start up again in the second semester. And when her mother asked her whether she wants to do it, she agreed to do it. Now, why she agreed to do it the second time is a good question. And people would want to know that. That's a legitimate question. But you want to avoid the characterization why. First of all, her mother may have asked her that, or first of all, she may have asked herself that. And by asking it as I suggested a few times, it's a little judgy. It's a little bit accusatory. It suggests that maybe she did something wrong or something bad or she was foolish. And you want to avoid that with someone who's a victim. So if you need to know the answer, you just might want to switch it up a little bit. You know, Daniela, is there a reason you went back to chess class in second semester? Daniela, what was on your mind when mom asked you whether you wanted to go back to chess class for the second semester? Now, you told her you wanted to go back. What were you thinking when mom asked you that? So those kinds of questions, they get at the same issue that a why question would, but they're a little less accusatory, and therefore you might get a legitimate response. One that makes sense and one that explains things for the jury or for your supervisor or for yourself as a forensic interviewer. Another issue that arises from time to time is when children use words or phrases or characterize things in a way that they don't really understand, or we're curious about whether they really understand the language they're using. For example, from time to time, a child may say, "I'm here because I was raped." And you would want to do what we call check for definition, and that could arise in a lot of different ways. But in my example just now, you might say to the child, "You know, Daniela, lots of kids have different meanings for words that they use. The word rape may mean something to you and it may mean something different to me. So what do you mean by rape? Tell me what happened. Tell me what he did." So that's called check for definition. Check for definition. It could arise in all kinds of different ways. What happened when you went in the shed? We began to make out. Did something else happen? No, we only made out. Well, you know, Daniela, I know what made out means to me, and I know what to make out means to me. What does to make out mean to you? And what happened? Tell me what happened in the shed. You see, that's called check for definition. We can't make assumptions that they're using the language in the way that's most commonly understood. So that's something that arises commonly, more often than not, in a forensic interview. Another thing that comes up and you want to be mindful of are questions surrounding how many times. Now, forensic interviewers and law enforcement, they want to know, did this happen 10 times, 20 times, 5 times? It's a common area of inquiry for police officers and law enforcement, and for anybody who's looking at investigating a crime or investigating some act. So small children aren't really good at sequence. They're not really good at numbering. They're not really good at chronology. There's a lot of things they're not good at. They're not even good at counting. They may be able to count from 1 to 10, but it's rather rote. They just know the mechanics of counting 1 to 10. And we have to be careful with how many times. For example, you may ask a child, how many times did he come in your room and put his mouth on your vagina? And they may go 132. And when we hear that response, we find that to be a response that's not really born of truth. It seems highly speculative. The number's too precise to have any real meaning. What it does communicate to us is a lot of times. So when kids want to tell us it happened a lot of times, they'll sometimes tell us what seems like a precise number, but that's extremely high because it felt like it was 132 times. So for law enforcement purposes, we don't need to know the exact number of times. What we need to know is whether it happened once or more than once. And best practice tells us that's the way to ask about how many times something happened. Kids are capable of answering that question, even very young children. Did it happen once or more than once? So if they say it happened more than once or it happened a lot, then you might say to them, well, tell me about one time that you remember best. Or sometimes kids like to tell me about the time they remember best. Sometimes kids like to tell me about the last time. Tell me the one that you want to talk about. So if it happened on multiple occasions, you give them the power to pick the one that they want to talk about. And that's much better than asking them for precision or how many times. And one of the